Hello, friends. I am delighted to be with you today here on the Case for Life program. Thank you for joining us. We're going to take a dive today into some of the smartest people on the other side of the abortion debate. Now, you might think, wait a minute, this is a television show. I don't need a graduate course to understand this issue. And you're right. By and large, we stick to street level stuff here on this show. But let me tell you why you need to understand the smartest people on the other side of this debate. Right now, as you know, our culture is having a huge argument over two key questions that impact you, your kids, and your grandkids for decades to come ahead of us. And here are the two questions we're haggling about in the culture. Number one, we're arguing over the question of truth. Namely, is moral truth real and knowable? Or is it just a preference like deciding I'm going to eat chocolate ice cream because I like it better than vanilla? Is truth true when it comes to morality, or do we just make up the rules for ourselves? The second question we're arguing about that's related to the first is this: what makes humans valuable in the first place? Is there a truth attached to human nature? Heck, does human nature even exist objectively to begin with? What makes us valuable as human beings? Are we valuable for what we do functionally in terms of our immediately exercisable capacities? Or are we valuable because we have a particular nature that as Christians we know bears the image of our Maker? And those two questions are driving debates over abortion, transhumanism, the definition of marriage, even the whole idea about can I transition to a gender that I maybe wasn't conceived with? These are very deep philosophical questions, the question of truth and the question of human value. And it's important for us as Christians to understand who the people are that are driving these ideas into the culture. Because here's what happens. I know it's true. You think, hey, I don't hear this academic stuff being quoted when I talk to my neighbor about an issue like abortion, or maybe even someone at my church. But here's what you do hear. You hear some rendition or some version of an idea that actually began in the academic ivory towers. And it's helpful if we know the roots of those ideas, know what those arguments look like in their most accurate and strongest form, so that we can respond persuasively to people in the culture who absorb these ideas without much critical thought. And if you think we're ever going to win the abortion debate without winning the philosophical battle that's in front of us, you're living in a dream world. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start a 5-part series on dealing with the thinkers on the other side of the issue that I think present the biggest challenge. Not the biggest challenge in that we can't answer their arguments, but the biggest challenge in that their ideas are getting some level of traction in the culture, and we want to be prepared to engage them. Now, I know you're thinking, okay, our pro-life argument is pretty straightforward. Premise 1, it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Premise 2, abortion does that. Conclusion, therefore, abortion's wrong. Yeah, that's our argument, and you know how we defend it. We defend it from science by arguing that from the earliest stages of development, from the one-cell stage, you were a distinct, living, and whole human being, and we argue philosophically that there's no essential difference between you, the embryo, and you, the adult, that would justify killing you at that earlier stage of development. And that basic pro-life argument, which by now you should have committed to memory, we've covered it enough on this program, that basic pro-life argument is grounded in a larger view of the human person known as the substance view of human value. And let me unpack what the substance view entails so you can make sense of it. It sounds like a big philosophical term, but I think you'll agree it really isn't that hard once you kind of unpack it. The substance view says this: living things maintain their identity through time and change. In other words, a puppy that loses a leg is still a puppy or a dog by nature. In other words, living things have underlying natures or essences, some would call it a soul, I'm comfortable with all of those terms, that define their identity, ground them in change through time, and allow us to say we have the same being at the beginning of their existence as we do at the end. Now, you stop to think about it for a moment. A property thing like my 66 Mustang that's sitting in the garage right beneath this studio is really just a sum total of its parts. In fact, if you were to go out there and look at it right now, the first thing you'd say is, man, that's a beautiful car. And it is. It's in phenomenal shape. It's vintage burgundy. It's been a great hobby to have it as a way to just have a distraction from life. But here's the thing. That 1966 Mustang is technically not the same car that rolled off the assembly line, 62 years ago? No, because you stop to think about it. The tires have been changed. The brake shoes have been changed. Recently, I just changed the carburetor and redid the cooling system. Not long before that, I replaced the water pump, and then I went through and really rebuilt the brake system. I put in new wheel cylinders, changed the master cylinder, put in new spring hardware. I've done a lot of work to this car to keep it running at the highest level of efficiency. The parts have been changed, is my point. And when you deal with something that's a property thing, or what some philosophers refer to as an artifact, you change the parts, you kind of change the thing. Here's a way to think about it as well. Suppose you went out to my back deck, which I'm, again, not sitting that far from, and you replaced every plank of wood on that deck. Now, you would say it's still a deck, yes, but is it the same deck that was here before I replaced every part in it? And you'd probably say, well, no, it's kind of a different deck because after all, you've gone through and all the lumber that was there previously, piece by piece, you've replaced. So technically, although it's still a deck in terms of how it functions, it's not the same deck that it was before. And I think you'd be right to say that. However, when it comes to living things like human beings, plants and animals, reptiles, fish, whatever, living things are not mere part-like things like that deck. Rather, living things maintain their identity, though their physical parts and properties may change. For example, if I lose an arm or lose an eye, I am the same human being after that tragedy as I am before. There's no substantial change to my nature that changes what I am fundamentally. I am still Scott Klusendorf. I am the same Scott Klusendorf before and after that regrettable loss of body function. And that's what I want us to understand here. When it comes to saying that the unborn are equal to us as adults, that the unborn me is identical to the adult me, what I mean is I'm the same being at that stage of development back there as I eventually developed into later in life. Sure, my capacities changed, my ability to function has increased, I hopefully have gained in intellect and physical stature, but I'm the same Scott Klusendorf now as I was at the one cell stage. I was unnamed back then, but I'm the same ontological being. That's the substance view. And the substance view concludes this way. If I'm intrinsically valuable today, I was intrinsically valuable back then when I was an embryo because I'm identical to my former fetal and embryonic self, okay? So that's the graduate part of this session for today's show. Now, what's interesting is there are two rival views out in the culture when it comes to the human person. The first view is what we call the performance view. The performance view says this: you're not intrinsically valuable. Actually, you're only functionally valuable. What gives you value and a right to life is not possessing a particular nature, in this case, a human nature that bears the image of God. Rather, what makes you valuable is your immediately exercisable traits, like self-awareness, the ability to feel pain, the ability to value your existence over time, the ability to recognize that you want and value your life. I mean, it's always some cognitive trait that gets selected for this, but that's the performance view. Humans have value only insofar as they can immediately exercise certain traits. Now, the rival view to that, which I hold as a pro-lifer, is the endowment view of human value. The endowment view says this: what matters is not what traits you can immediately exercise. What matters is that you were endowed by your Creator, a transcendent source, with intrinsic value that is part of your nature, whether you ever immediately exercise certain traits or not. So, for example, a child that never learned, sadly, to speak, we would not say he's less of a human being or a person under the endowment view. We would simply say he's failed to flourish according to his nature, that by nature he ought to be able to speak, and it's a tragedy that he can't. And as a result, we're going to do everything we can in the medical field to try to restore that loss of flourishing, where we wouldn't make that same worry or we wouldn't make that same effort if we were dealing with a rock. A rock by nature does not speak. And by the way, we wouldn't make that same effort if we were talking about a pet dog either. A dog that can't read is not a tragedy. But a 16-year-old young woman who can't read is one, precisely because she's failing to flourish according to her nature. So on the endowment view of human value, we align very nicely with the substance view of human persons that says we have an inner nature that grounds our identity through time and change, and what really matters is not our immediately exercisable traits, but do we have a particular nature? That's what grounds our identity. And if the unborn has a human nature like you and me, and of course we believe it does, then he has value and a right to life just like we do, because the being that he is at the embryonic stage is identical to the being he will be when he grows up. Not identical in function or form, will look different, but in terms of having the same human nature throughout whatever physical changes happen. So that's the philosophical background to the pro-life view. Now, there are thinkers who challenge this, and today we're going to look at the first one, Lord willing, if time permits. Her name is Kate Greasley. And Kate Greasley is a very interesting author. She's in Oxford. She's written this book, Arguments About Abortion, and it's a very good book. I don't agree with its conclusions, but it's well written. I disagree with it, and I'll give you some reasons why in just a moment. But she is a thoughtful critic, very winsome, fun to watch lecture because she's quite animated. But I do think she's mistaken. And here's what she argues. First, let's argue about what she gets right. Or I should say, let's talk about what she gets right. She gets right that the abortion debate is not about bodily autonomy. You know, sometimes you've heard people say, well, I don't care if the unborn is a human being. A woman has a right to control her own body. And if she doesn't want to have support given to a dependent child in her womb that's using her body, then too bad, she can have the abortion, and we may regret that a human being was killed, but that's just the way it goes. She has a right to bodily autonomy. Kate Greasley says that argument does not work, and she flatly rejects it. In fact, she wrote one of the most persuasive rejoinders to the arguments of people like Judith Jarvis Thompson and to some extent David Boonin and others who have tried to argue for bodily rights, and she says it won't work for this reason. You cannot get from an alleged right to withhold support to an alleged right to intentionally kill an innocent human person. If the unborn are human persons, then they too have a right to life, and the bodily autonomy argument does nothing to dislodge that right to life. So she rejects out of hand the whole bodily rights argument. And I think it's very good that she does. Instead, here's what she says. The entire debate turns on the status of the unborn, and she concedes that the unborn are human. She affirms that, but she denies that they're persons. And here's the question she puts out there as being relevant. When does morally relevant personhood begin? Now, she says it can't begin at conception without there being absurd consequences, and she gives three. Here's the first one. She says if conception is the beginning of human personhood, when we should value human life, then we're led to the absurd conclusion that we should mourn the loss of a two-celled embryo more than we would a 10-year-old child. Then she gives a second example. She says, well, then miscarriage in that case would represent the biggest form of human tragedy in existence, because we all know there's millions of miscarriages worldwide, and that would mean we'd be obligated to spend billions in every developed nation in the country trying to combat this unbelievable loss of valuable human life. Then the third example she gives to argue that conception is absurd is that if we were in a burning research lab and we had a choice of saving in one corner 1,000 frozen embryos on ice, or on the other side of the room in a corner, a 6-year-old girl, we would be obligated to save the 1,000 embryos and let the 6-year-old burn. But she says, in fact, our intuitions all go to saving the 6-year-old. So therefore, not a big deal that we would have abortion rights and treat the unborn as not having morally relevant personhood status at conception. Now, the first thing you should notice about this, notice she has not engaged any of the scientific literature that says the beginning of human existence begins at conception, nor has she dealt philosophically, in my view, with the question of how we account for human equality given her argument. Instead, she just tries to reduce it to the absurd. Well, the first thing I'll say is this: my feelings about something do not change what it is. Suppose I did grieve more the loss of an adult child than I would an embryo fetus that my wife might miscarry. Suppose that were true. How do my feelings about something change what it is? I would grieve hearing that one of my own children died today more than I would hearing that 6,000 kids died in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh today from malnutrition. But it doesn't follow those kids in those developing countries are less human and valuable than my own child. My feelings about something don't change what it is. So her argument based on the loss of, or I should say based on grieving, is not persuasive to me. Nor is her argument about miscarriage. Look, miscarriage is a tragedy, but there's a world of difference between intentionally killing an innocent human being and not being able to stop something that nature spontaneously triggers. It doesn't follow that because nature spontaneously triggers a miscarriage that A, the embryos in question are not human and valuable, or B, we may intentionally kill them. You know, earthquakes happen in third world countries, kill hundreds of thousands of people. That doesn't justify mass murder. So I don't find that argument at all persuasive on her part. And then finally, her idea that when it comes to conception being absurd, this embryo rescue case she speaks of, suppose I am in a building that's on fire, and suppose I save my own child over you. Does it mean you're less human and valuable? And as Chris Kaiser points out, I think quite well, we all have an equal right to life. We do not have an equal right to be rescued. So I am not sold on her argument here. The fact that I save one human over others does not mean those left behind are not fully human. So I don't find her argument here attempting to reduce conception as the beginning point of morally relevant personhood persuasive at all. Then she raises another question. Why should we suppose, she says, that merely having human DNA warrants giving zygotes a right to life? And she is basically saying that just because you're human doesn't mean, okay, you're human, you have human DNA, you have human genes. Her reply is, so what? That doesn't mean anything. That's just an example of speciesism, favoring your own status over other species. And she also thinks it's a circular argument when you say humans have value because of the kind of thing they are, not some function they perform. We'll come back to that in a bit, but then she presents what she thinks is her most persuasive argument to show that merely having human DNA doesn't warrant personhood. And she says, imagine a transgenic spectrum. And here's what she says. Imagine we had an ape where one by one we replaced each of its genes and replaced the ape genes with human DNA and human genes. At some point, the chimp would have more human DNA and more human genes than chimp DNA and chimp genes. At what point would we say we've suddenly no longer got a chimp and now we have a human? And our answer is, well, we wouldn't think that ape was suddenly a human being simply because we replaced its genes. Therefore, merely having human DNA or human genes does not make you special in a philosophical sense. Now, on that note, let's think about that last point for a moment. Suppose we did change somehow a chimp into a human being. Well, that would require a substantial change of nature. The chimp would have to stop being something else and start being a human being. It would have to stop being a monkey or an ape and start being a human being. And merely changing physical parts doesn't do that. And I think here she misconstrues the pro-life argument. We are not arguing that humans have value strictly because they have human DNA. That is a characteristic of their existence. But here's the real point we're arguing. Humans have value and a right to life because they possess a particular nature. That is a rational nature that, as Christians, we know bears the image of God. The chimp does not have that rational nature. In fact, if you think about the difference between an amoeba and an embryo, you come to some real clear distinctions that I think we need to keep in mind. The amoeba will never be self-aware. Why? Because it's not in its nature to be self-aware. It will never be a rational being because it's not in its nature to be self-aware. But the embryo, it is in its nature to be self-aware, to be a rational being. The amoeba is not rational because of its nature, because of the kind of thing it is. The embryo, the human embryo, is rational by nature, needing only time and age to become a rational being. The first has a lack of rationality because of the kind of thing it is. The second isn't rational right at the moment simply because it's young. And that distinction is something that I think Greasley overlooks. Now, her next point is to say that the counterexamples that pro-lifers raise against the performance view do indeed seem to refute it if you assume that the performance view is arbitrary. In other words, pro-lifers point out that if you're going to argue that self-awareness is what gives us value and a right to life, well, then somebody in a coma who's not self-aware would seem to diminish their right to life. Or if you're going to argue that feeling pain is what gives us our value and right to life, those with more of that ability would be more valuable and human than those with less of that ability. Now, Greasley looks at these counterexamples and says, you're right. When we look at these things that we're setting up as being decisive, self-awareness, the ability to interact with your environment, the cognitive traits we pick out as being decisive, they do appear arbitrary. But her answer is not to fix that. Her answer is to say, okay, but you pro-lifers have your own arbitrary mess to clean up. Now, notice what she's just done. She hasn't refuted the accusation that her position is arbitrary when she picks out all these selected traits. She simply says, oh, you got your own mess to clean up. That'd be kind of like me getting busted for speeding. And I say to the cop, well, all these other people on the freeway were speeding too. Why are you pulling me over when they were speeding too? The fact that somebody else is doing something doesn't justify your own position or behavior. So she says, look, here's your problem, pro-lifers. Conception is arbitrary too. And the example she cites is this. Well, conception is not a threshold. It's really a process. And you can't tell me where in the process that embryo becomes a human being. It's somewhere along a spectrum there, but you can't tell me where. That does not refute the pro-life argument. Now, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I'm going to tell you the rest of the reasons why I'm not persuaded by her case. We'll pick those up when we come back on the other side. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position, You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Welcome back, everybody. Boy, we've been digging deep today with some intellectual, heady stuff, but bear with me. So let me finish up a few things about Kate Greasley, and then we're going to continue with her in our next episode of the Case for Life program. Now, she goes on to argue that the accusation that her position is arbitrary, where she picks out traits decisive for personhood, that if you say that they're arbitrary, they're only arbitrary, she argues, if you view a sharp threshold distinction between person and non-person. And Greasley goes on to argue that if you think about personhood accurately, it emerges vaguely, almost gradually, really. There's no existential pop where one minute you go from being a non-person with rights to being one with rights. And she gives the example of emerging from a child to a young adult, that the changes along that spectrum happen quietly, almost unnoticed in many cases, and it's a very vague, gradual emergence of the young adult phase of life. And she says that's how we should view personhood. She says personhood is a complex mix of psychological traits that only emerge gradually. Now, right away, that raises a problem because she realizes that these properties continue to emerge long after birth. The development of a 2-year-old's brain is vastly different than that of a 26-year-old. And so she realizes right away, I may have an inequality problem here. How am I going to get from, saying, these traits emerge gradually to saying all human beings at a certain point have equal dignity and value? And she's going to submit what she calls the range view of human personhood. And here's what she says. Once we stipulate a range of personhood, everybody in that range has equal value in personhood, even though their development traits continue to grow. And she says, think of the state of New Jersey. Princeton and Hoboken are equally in the state, even though Hoboken is barely in virtue of being on the border of New York on the Hudson River, while Princeton is right in the middle of it. And she says, after birth, you are in the range of person, and no further development changes anything about you. We're going to pick up why that view doesn't work in our next episode when we continue our thinking on the major players out there at the philosophical level. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for joining us. And if your mind feels stretched, good. We want to stretch you here and help you to grow so you can be the best pro-life apologist out there.